Great. Well, good to be with you this morning. Again, I'm Manuel Pastor. I am from the scandal-plagued University of Southern California. I know that was intended to make the UCLA people feel good about themselves. I should say that although I teach at USC, my kids both went to college at UCLA. Because they knew that meant that I would have to pay full tuition, so just wanted to punish their dad. So it's a really exciting panel. I'll have them introduce themselves in a minute. Wanted to say two things to get started. The first, I always like to let people know before I begin speaking that while I'm talking, if my voice kind of tires out or sounds a little raspy, it's not because I've been screaming at the Supreme Court for the last 3 or 4 days. Although, fuck them.
Start us off strong.
Bernard is going, why did I invite him? It's actually because I have a voice condition that's called spasmodic dysphonia, spasms around the voice box that can cause your voice to break. And this is true. It gets treated once a month with Botox because that's how we treat everything in Los Angeles. So,
I got jokes.
so we'll get to the panel in a second, but I wanted to say that we have been through a tough last couple of years. And COVID, in many ways, was the disease that revealed our illness as a society. The racial wealth gap, which meant that some people didn't have a cushion from which to survive in hard times. The digital divide here in Los Angeles County, 13% of white kids at the beginning of the pandemic went home to a house without a laptop and a high-speed internet connection. That figure for black kids was around 38%, for Latino kids around 40%. We went through tremendous differences in health access. Also, people who lacked immigration status or lived in mixed status families who were unable to access the resources that were made available. So this was the disease that revealed our illness as a society, including in sports and play, which we'll be talking about. And then the second thing I'd like to, in Spanish we say, plantear, to plant, to make sure as part of the conversation, as a segue into the next one, is the tremendous mental trauma that this pandemic has caused for everyone, for kids in particular, which I know that you'll talk about. But the trauma of losing loved ones, I know that's probably true for some of you, or family, but also the trauma of realizing that you live in a society that didn't really care about you, that labeled your parent an essential worker, but has never treated you like an essential part of our system, our society, etc. So those are the topics we're going to delve into. We have a stellar panel, and I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves by giving their name, where they work, and maybe what kind of work, and what is your favorite form of play. So let's start immediately to my left with Rebecca.
Hi, I'm Rebecca Dudovitz. I'm a pediatrician and school health researcher at UCLA, and I have 2 kids, and my favorite form of play is shooting hoops with them in the backyard.
Excellent.
Hey y'all, my name is Megan. I am the founder of the Center for Healing and Justice Through Sport. I also have a little person, he's 2, and his new favorite way to make me exercise is to run through sprinklers basically all day, every day.
Hi, good morning, everybody. My name is Bianca Edison. I am a pediatric, orthopedic, and sports medicine physician at Children's Hospital Los Angeles, and I'm also faculty at USC. I also serve as the Vice Chair of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion for our Department of Surgery at the hospital. And my favorite form of play, I have two little ones, is what they call exploring. So we just walk and just get to enjoy whatever we see in nature.
That's great.
Hi everyone, I'm Julie McCleery. I work at the University of Washington in the Center for Leadership in Athletics, and I also help run the King County Play Equity Coalition, which is helping to close the play equity gap in the Seattle area. I have 3 kids, not so little ones, so they don't play with me so much anymore, and mostly I like to go out hiking and enjoy all the beauty that the Pacific Northwest has to offer.
Great. Gotta say, speaking about those little ones is making me feel old. I just turned 66, which I describe as the new 65. And I have a 35-year-old and a 32-year-old musician and a yoga instructor. So my favorite form of play is checking my bank account to look at the transfers. So Bianca, I want to start with you to just give us kind of a diagnostic of where we're at right now. How are kids showing up, not just to the hospital, but sort of showing up in their lives right now, given what's happened over the last few years?
Yeah, so I would say overall, our kids are hurting. And that is to say that they are hurting emotionally. This pandemic really exacerbated a lot of disparities and inequities in terms of access to play, access to each other, where they all of a sudden, the things that brought them a lot of joy were taken away for many of them. And they had to see also certain inequities were certain people had opportunity and then they did not. And so rates of anxiety and depression have increased, particularly amongst our minoritized communities and our females. And then they are hurting physically in terms of not being able to play. So our rates of obesity and other comorbid conditions like diabetes in the youth are increasing. And then for those who had opportunities, there was a lot of enthusiasm to try and get back to sport or continue without recognizing the 1.5 or 2 years of deconditioning that happened. And so not having that foundation from which to play anymore, we're seeing a lot of injuries amongst our youth that otherwise we wouldn't see, which then exacerbates the emotional and psychological trauma because you didn't play for a while, you got a small little taste, and then you got hurt, and then you suddenly can't play anymore. So we're seeing a lot of that.
Sounds painful, both for them and for you as a helper for them.
Right. So not only am I having to put on my sports medicine physician hat, but my counselor hat. So a lot of times when kids come in to see me, I don't start off to ask them, well, what are you here to see me for? I start off, how are you doing? Because there are a lot of things that are happening in their lives that are informing how they show up to even see us every day.
Rebecca, what are you finding in your encounters with young people?
Yeah, my experience really echoes a lot of what Bianca just described. I'm a general pediatrician, and so I see kids from all walks of life who come into my clinic. And without a doubt, while we had a pre-existing mental health crisis, we were already hurting and struggling before. I have never seen such a huge toll in terms of mental health and well-being as I have over the last 2 years. Absolutely, obesity, overweight, and deconditioning increased along with that mental health burden. And for many children, there was truly no access to physical activity and wellness. We have found that that burden is also carried by parents. We know that parents' well-being is connected to their children as well, and parents were suffering too. And parents were really struggling to find opportunities to fill those gaps. Many families look to their schools to fill those gaps. And when we asked parents what they needed from their schools, over 70% said their child needed help with mental health and well-being from their school, and 2/3 said that their children needed help from their school with regards to physical activity and access to sports. And that's data from Los Angeles. That's what LA parents told us.
And do we really have those all available in all of our schools?
Exactly. Schools are definitely struggling as well to fill those gaps, and so it's so critical that we imbue that with equity. While some schools are doing a really great job and stepping up because they have the resources to do so, other schools are really struggling to meet all of that need.
I know a little bit of that somewhat firsthand, secondhand. My wife is the superintendent of a school district, the Lawndale Elementary School District. She says that every year during the pandemic was like 5 years of regular districting. How many of you in education out there? Probably feels like that to y'all too. Just let my wife know that I talked about her, and I think she's a hero. And this has also meant that I've cooked dinner for 2.5 years, so it's good. I started with you too, partly because it's in the script, but also because, like me, you forgot to wear your sneakers. So I wanted to privilege you. So let me move to Julie right now, because in a way, there's some stuff that's new about this, but in a way, this is a continuation of an older story about structural inequities in sports and play. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's well said, that these inequities existed, but COVID laid it all bare for us. There are so many to talk about, but I'll try to stick to 2 or 3. I mean, one is obviously the discrepancy between the pay-to-play system and the more public system of sport and play. So in Washington State, as in California, schools and parks and rec departments were shuttered and kids weren't able to play through those more affordable mechanisms, but the pay-to-play system was robust, and teams were traveling to states where there weren't COVID closures. I know of a baseball program in Seattle that flew everyone to Idaho to play each other, right, to practice and play each other. So, or parents who rented RVs and drove up and down the East Coast to take their kid to lacrosse tournaments that weren't happening on the West Coast. So, the starkness of that just was in greater relief during the pandemic. We got to see it plain and clear, and those led to a lot of the individual level inequities that you all see in your practice. The other that is maybe a little bit less clear from my vantage point is the lack of regulation in youth sports and the lack of centralization. So when COVID hit, who was in charge of youth sports? In our state, there wasn't anyone, right? Maybe other states had different mechanisms, but at first it sat with the governor's policy advisor for outdoor recreation. And who did he convene? He convened the largest providers in the state to advise on that, or decisions were made along with pro teams. So again, we were privileging and putting at the table the folks who were serving the pay-to-play market and not the kids in community who most needed access. So when decisions got made about reopening, they were made in ways that made it harder for community-based providers to reopen because the high cost of testing or the high cost of the hygiene stations that needed to be put in place for opening. So again, even when there was some reopening, much, much slower in those communities where kids most needed opportunities to play. And lastly, I'll just say, I think it also showed how this isn't an inequity as much as a lack of prioritization in the youth development sector in general for sport, play, and physical activity. It was just so hard. We felt like we were screaming into the void to get people to think about where's PE, where's recess, where's physical activity in the conversation about what youth need right now.
Megan, what are you seeing in terms of what youth need right now in order to deal with these circumstances?
Great question. They need a lot. We've just heard all of the sort of the bad news, right? But what I think is good news, yay, good news, right? What I think is good news is that there are amazing youth sport providers, that there are people who are sitting in this room who are offering these opportunities to young people. And when we do, we really have the opportunity to have, in my opinion, don't hit your mic, in my opinion, a deeper impact than anything else, right? Sport is uniquely suited to meet this moment. And I think when we understand just like a tiny bit of brain science, where are my brain nerds at? Brain? No? Thank you. I knew there was one at least. When we understand just a little bit about the brain, we know that sport has 3 things that the brain absolutely needs in order to recover from the stress that we've all been facing over the last 2 years, so that we can get back to performing in school, right? We're hearing a lot about learning loss. We're hearing about the need to be more active and get back to our physical health. And then obviously the need to recover in a psychological way, or get our mental health back. And sport has those things, 3 of them. First, and most importantly, relationships, right? Relationships that help us feel safe. Relationships that can help buffer the impact of adversity for young people, right? Relationships that make sure that young people feel some sense of control and predictability about their experience, right? When everything is so unpredictable, if a coach can help a young person know that, like, this is what this week is gonna look like, this is what this practice is gonna look like, this is what you can do to make yourself feel better or perform better, that predictability, those relationships matter so much. The second thing is just movement, right? Without movement, we won't address some of these the need for physical health in the same way, but we also need to address it from a education and mental health perspective, because without it, we'll stay dysregulated, right? The stress in our systems will stay there. And when we move, when we have patterned, repetitive, rhythmic activity, we experience better regulation, right? It helps regulate our stress response and open up the superhighway to our cortex, right? And open up our brains for learning in a way that if we don't move, we don't get as regulated. And then the third thing is this idea that sport has these manageable patterns of stress, right? After the last 2.5 years, it is totally normal to want to wrap kids up in bubble wrap and hope nothing bad ever happens to them again, right? I know that is my instinct with my 2-year-old, right? And maybe if we did that, we could keep them from further harm, but we won't help them heal, right? Because the opposite of overwhelming stress, the opposite of trauma, the opposite of adversity is not no stress. It's little doses of stress. It's the right amount of stress that helps us build resilience. And sport has so many of those opportunities to stress our bodies a little bit, but make sure that we come all the way back down, that we recover from that stress. Instead of being elevated and just keep getting elevated, running into more and more stressful things. Stress our bodies, come all the way back down, right? Manageable patterns of stress. Learn a little bit of a skill, right? We don't go from, if we're trying to lift more weights, we don't go from 0 to 50 pounds. We go from 0 to 5 to 10 to 15 to 20, right? Those doses of stress, making sure that the dosing and spacing of that stress is the right way that helps us build resilience instead of making us vulnerable. Because stress in and of itself isn't bad. It's what kind of stress we have, what kind of control we have over it, and what the patterns of that stress is. And so sport delivers in ways that nothing else can. And this group of people is delivering it to all the young people who need it so desperately.
It's great, and I love your optimism. I consider myself to be very optimistic as well. I'm the kind of person who can walk into a room full of manure and say, wow, there must have been a pony here.
He's really got jokes.
In our conversation getting ready for this, Bianca and Rebecca, you both made a big distinction, not distinction, but you wanted to be really clear about sports and play, and the way in which sometimes when we talk about sports, we're privileging ability, kind of organization. It's like, can you talk a little bit about that? I'll start with Bianca.
No, absolutely. I think that one of the great things, one of the silver linings of this pandemic is that it has given us opportunity to reassess and reimagine. So from a business standpoint, we've been able to look at what sort of things were we forced to do that we can adopt and make things better, to bring stressors down for our population, to help things run more efficiently. And so I think also with sport and with athleticism, it also gives us the opportunity to reimagine the concept of sport and athlete. And so we need to redefine that. Athlete, when someone thinks of that word, many times people think about the elitism, the highest pinnacle. And that's not what athlete is, truly. An athlete is someone who continually moves, strives, learns to become and be part of a community to better each other. And with that, I would like to challenge us all to think of everyone as an athlete. Because if we truly do that, then we can encourage everyone to keep moving, keep participating, keep playing, which then elevates kind of our atmosphere and our community of sport. And with that, I want us to reimagine what sport is. It is not this ultra competitive, cutthroat environment in which we have basically created this adulteration of youth, which we're asking them to go cross state lines and fly to play for this coveted trophy or bragging rights. That's not how it should be. We should encourage everyone to play. If we ask kids, what is the number one reason of why you play sport? They say, to have fun, to play with my friends, and to develop skills. Way further down the list is competition and winning. And so I think if we do that, then we will succeed. We will create more opportunities for everyone, despite their background, despite their ability, despite where they come from, to just play and have fun, which helps develop more skills. And it keeps them going. It keeps them in the game.
I see a lot of nods on that. I'll go to Rebecca, but Megan, you were...
Yeah, well, I think, we sort of idealize sport, and what we're talking about is sport when we do it the right way, right? There is reason to idealize sport because it has so much potential. It just gets really messy when the wrong interests are being served by it. And so at this core, we're sitting on this incredible solution, but we do have to make sure that it's first not doing any harm.
Rebecca, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I absolutely agree that we really need to broaden access to sports, play, and physical activity and really cultivate this love of physical activity and integrating that into our lives over the life course. And I just want to give a shout out to physical educators because that is really a huge part of that mission of introducing all kids to physical education, which includes those physical abilities, but is also social emotional skill building. And a huge portion of physical education relates to those social emotional skills, which again are skills that our children are going to need throughout their entire lives. Making sure that children retain that fun element to sports is critical to keeping kids engaged, and also reducing that bar to entering into sports and athleticism, making it attractive to all kids, even if they don't see themselves as an athlete. I also just want to give a shout out to the importance of those relationships. We know that, as an example, kids who can name a teacher or coach in their social networks have healthier self-concepts, they have lower rates of substance use and violence. So it's healing in many ways, both that adult to child relationship and also the peers that they get a chance to interact with in the context of a team and during sports and play. So 100% I echo everything that the other panelists have said.
Great. Let me go to Julie to start another conversation, although this is a very experienced panel, so it means no matter what I ask, you're going to say what you want. So, but the research suggests, according to some of the information in the prep, that the #1 indicator of whether a child will access sport or structured play is their household income. And you talked a little bit about that. Can you talk more about that? But also, how about the questions of race, immigration status, gender, disability or ability? How are those playing out as well? Because I think it's sometimes almost convenient to say it's just income when we've got so many other structural impediments and barriers.
Yeah, good question. I can speak most fluently about the research that we've done in King County about that, which I think is broadly applicable nationally. And when we did our research in King County looking at the landscape of youth sports and physical activity, we wanted to make sure that we were asking questions about the population that was living there, and King County is the county with the 3rd highest rate of foreign-born residents in the country. And so we looked specifically at immigrant status or proxy language spoken at home, and that was the group of kids most disenfranchised from sport and physical activity, which I think points out the ways in which it's not just cost. There's actually cultural and language and transportation barriers. There's so many barriers, whether it's like a program offers a scholarship, but those forms are only in English and they're found deep on a website that somebody has to spend time looking for, and they're not going to be able to get it, or folks don't feel comfortable filling out those forms because they don't have pre-existing relationships with those programs to know that their information is going to be safe. So I think that the important part of saying that it's not just about cost is knowing that scholarshiping is not the answer, right? It's not about keeping the structure we have and paying kids and families to be able to participate in a structure that is not developmentally appropriate and not suited for them in all the ways that folks have talked about. So the pandemic offered us an opportunity, and I had conversations with you all and some of you out there about how it did offer this opportunity to pivot and to meet the moment, as Renata said, to maybe dismantle some of those structures that we had built. I don't know if we're doing it yet. I don't know if we're more focused on free play and opportunities for physical literacy and movement generally, but it did offer us the opportunity to do that so that these layers upon layers of structural impediments could be stripped away to offer more joyful, playful, community-based physical activity moments. So hopefully we're keeping that in our sights as we continue to move through and come out of the pandemic.
There's like 5 things I want to lift up from what you said, but I just want to lift up one because I think it might be important for the audience that was kind of buried in what you said. King County is one of the places in the United States, and by the way, it's a national trend, where the growth of people of color is in the suburbs of South King County.
Yes, that's right.
And the city is actually widening. And in Los Angeles County, taken as a whole, the suburbs are just as diverse as the city of Los Angeles and have exactly the same poverty rates taken as a whole as well. When we think about reaching disadvantaged communities, we frequently think city, but increasingly in America, that's our suburbs.
Yeah, thank you for calling that out, because I also think it's important to point out that Seattle itself, when you look at measures of access to parks, for example, walk shed, those kind of things, Seattle does really well, but South King County doesn't. And that's actually where folks need that access even more and don't have it. So it is important to broaden our view on that sort of urban, suburban, and rural focal point.
Bianca, you were nodding a lot around this issue of other dimensions of disadvantage or lack of access or barriers to sports and play. What do you see?
So it's interesting. Some of we're looking at this in terms of just listening to our communities and to our actual stakeholders of youth sports. So listening to the youth and parents and what sort of barriers exist. And Transportation is one of them. Access to not only strong facilities, safe facilities, access to proper equipment is another one. I mean, if you think about it, even some of the most simple forms of equipment, like a sports bra for our female athletes or our transgender athletes. A proper fitting sports bra can be one of the things that is a deterrent to actual physical activity. Because if you are participating and you don't have the proper support and it's hurting, you're not going to continue to participate. Or if it's become so expensive where you cannot get a proper fitting sports bra because it costs $40 to $50 per sports bra, that is going to be a deterrent. If you don't have a proper ball to even participate in some of these sports. So it's those sort of things. The other thing is having those connections with people who look like you. That is another thing that is so important that we really need to look at. I look out in this audience here, and I'm so encouraged because everyone is here. But in some spaces, as you look at the coaching representation or the commissioner representation, the people who are making those large decisions about who gets funding and who doesn't, who gets access to certain fields and who doesn't, it becomes very homogenous. And we cannot ignore the sheer power of bias. And I'm not talking about explicit bias, and I'm talking about implicit bias that runs in all of us. And that sometimes we can make decisions based on certain biases that we have. And so we need to continue to have these conversations about those things and what we can do about it to help dismantle all of that.
That's a great segue into the last question I'll go through with all of you. And by way, it's like, how can we make change? By way of analogy, many of you may know that there's a famous economist, David Card, just got a Nobel Prize for research he did 25 years ago showing that raising the minimum wage doesn't actually cost employment. And we've known that for 25 years. It's been reproduced over and over again in study after study. But the minimum wage did not go up until there was a new way to talk about it as a living wage, a story. And there was a movement, the Fight for 15, which had a target and raised the wage there. So I'm a big believer in research. I'm a professor. We've talked a little bit about story. What's it going to take to build a movement for play equity? Rebecca, can you solve this problem for us?
Oh man, yeah, sure, no problem. What an easy question. What's it gonna take? I think it's gonna take an all-in approach, right? We all have to be at the table, and if anything can do it, I hope that centering on the health and safety and thriving of our children can do it. Everyone loves their children, and I think if we center our children at the kind of core of this discussion, hopefully that will motivate everyone to come to the table, because it's gonna take an all-in approach.
I would just add to that, everyone loves their children. It's the,
Yes,
Other people's
it's
children.
learning to love our children.
absolutely,
Right.
100%.
And understanding to make an investment in everyone. What's it going to take, Megan, and by the way, it could be Megan's movement too. So what's it going to take to build a movement?
Well, I think absolutely the sort of centering our young people, but I think in order to center our young people, we have to make an investment in the adults, right? One of the biggest barriers, I think, to real systemic change in sport is that we don't value the adults who are working with young people. We don't hold them accountable. We don't train them. We don't provide resources to them in the way that we do other adults who work with young people, right? If we let teachers get away with some of the things we let coaches get away with, that would never fly, right? We would never allow that. And so I think it takes real investment in the adults, both from a resource and an accountability perspective, in order to center young people. If we're really going to center young people and learn to love all of our kids, the investment needs to be made at the who is helping them, who is in charge of them, who is sort of minding the store while we're letting them have these experiences and opportunities.
Bianca, what's it going to take to build a movement?
One is education, and not just providing the data that we know, but putting those personal stories behind it. I think understanding what exists now so we can reimagine what we can do is important. The other thing is really having these talks, having these conversations, this collaboration, and really kind of thinking about outside of the box how we address these issues. So through sponsorship and really leveraging some of the power that we have to help advance these goals, shared space agreements. You know, there's a lot of private gyms that probably aren't being utilized 100%. But if we have a community-oriented mindset where we set aside time for other organizations, youth organizations, schools to come utilize those, then we might further that. Helping to utilize educational workshops that might be offered privately, but bringing that to underserved communities for coaches and whatnot at no cost, so that everyone can have the same equitable kind of stance or foundation from which to teach and support our youth, I think is very important also.
Julie.
Yeah, I'm going to go back to something I said at the beginning, which may or may not be popular out there, which is regulation. If we care enough about our kids that we want sports to be a safe, inclusive space, someone has to be in charge of it. I feel very much like if we want our coaches to be trained and educated, if we want parents to understand what is good about sport, what can be good, and what they should be on the lookout for that isn't good about sport, we need a body, whether it's at the state level or a national level, to help us make that commitment and make sport and movement a priority at the state or federal level. Because I feel like, as you started this question, like we've known for years and years that physical activity is vital to our mental and physical health, and that kids who are physically active become physically active adults who are healthy. So it's time to do something about it. Like, it's time to actually make that commitment in like a bold way in terms of policy and funding. So I would say regulate youth sports, make sure coaches are trained, make sure programs are actually following the commitments that they make to kids in terms of their health and well-being.
A lot of good ideas in that mix. So let me conclude with two things. First, let's thank our panelists. What an amazing group of leaders. And the thing about story made me think about the following story. When my son graduated from high school, he had applied to and been accepted and was going to the UCLA theater program. And I didn't quite understand that, being, an economist by training. But we took him, whole family, on a vacation. Actually, it was quite a big vacation, went to Hawaii. And one night, he and I were watching the sunset, looking in parallel fashion, not at each other, which is always a good time for an intimate male conversation. And so I asked him, I said, Joaquin, why are you going to theater school? What's the lure of that? And he leaned back, it only took a few seconds, and he said, I want to make things of beauty with my friends. And I think when we play sports, it's a thing of beauty with our friends. I think when we think about this as a movement, we're thinking about how do we build a world of beauty with our friends, a world that says there's no going back to what we had before, because that normal was not good enough, exactly what Julie was talking about. A world in which everyone gets a chance to play and participate, a world in which relationships are built, a world in which we celebrate play and sport. Thank you very much for your time. Let's talk about something.